I wanted to do a video on how you often hear spiritual people, mystics, who are into the new age typically say things like you got to raise your vibration or increase your frequency. And I wanted to analyze how that is actually very sound advice and how you could actually utilize this yourself to get yourself through any difficult situations or actually align yourself in ways that benefit yourself spiritually and physically. So, to begin, I think we need to understand what is a vibration. And the best way to look at this is to look at the entire universe, at least as we interact with it, as a series of excitations or agitated space that are trying to find equilibrium. And what that actually means is that when you're looking at our reality in totality, it suggests that what we call the electron is actually a just like a agitation in space that's moving along a set circuit or a set path. And that agitation, just like its base state of the universe, the fabric it exists with on, or as I like to think of it, the canvas of reality. That excitation or that electron is trying to find equilibrium so it can return to stillness. And the way this happens is through vibration or frequencies. And frequency is the way to say how fast is that vibration moving in relationship to other things around it. So you can think of it as like a circle, and every time that circle completes, that's one cycle or one frequency. Building on that, when we understand that this excitation is trying to return to stillness, we need to look at points in which stillness actually exists within the universe. And you'll find that at the center of pretty much everything, whether that be the center of an atom in its nucleus, or the still point inside of a torsion field, the geometry that describes the path of the electron as it moves around the absolute center or the center point of whatever is moving around. You can even see this in galaxies, in planets, and stars. They all have a central point in which energy is constantly moving around, reaching, and then inverting and coming out the other side. This cyclical pattern is what maintains matter in our reality. And with that, I think it's a good idea to look at how this vibration is trying to find that center point so it can return back to stillness, and then from that stillness, return back into vibration or different frequencies of agitation. So think of it like this. Imagine you have the top of a drum, and that top of a drum is still at the start, but then you tap it, and it slowly reverberates out to the sides, and then comes back, and then at that point, it equalizes and returns back to stillness. This is exactly how energy moves through a system. At the center of what we call a torsion field, there's a point of stillness that center point rests upon. That center point, when that energy slowly makes its way to that center point, it loses all of its up and down momentum or its vibration, and then translates that into an inverse of its movement. But that brief moment where there's a inversion, it returns to stillness. However, when it does that, it becomes a series of compressions that move out in a spherical fashion. These compressions or pressure waves then coalesce and then add up until they reach the boundary of whatever we're talking about. Whether we're talking about a torsion field of a localized space like a plasma, or a star or a planet, it hits the outer boundary, which is commonly called a double layer in plasma physics, or that outside wall, whatever you want to call it, and then it rebounds back in. Slowly, those longitudinal compression waves create more interference with each other until they again give rise to more vibration. So this is a common feature amongst all things in the universe, and it continues to happen over and over again. However, when we say you need to raise your vibration or raise your frequency, what we're really saying is you need to get yourself in a state where you're vibrating in resonance with harmonic structures that are beneficial to ourselves. So if you imagine that there are negative entities and positive entities out there, what their differences are is that one is vibrating at a higher rate or a frequency that's more in line with positive emotions versus ones that are operating in a slower vibratory rate, which are more in line with physical matter and physical expressions and lower emotions like sadness, anger, and grief. This is really the only difference between entities that are disincarnated, what we call angels and demons. So how this relates to how we can actually feel our emotions and work with these vibrations is that each one of our emotions actually have their own frequency in which they operate on. And while when you stop and think about this might actually not be a surprise, the key here is recognizing it in the moment. For instance, I'm sure that when many of you have experienced stints of anger, I know personally that when I'm angry, the easiest way to get rid of it is just to have one quick burst and let that out. Whether that be hitting something or, yelling. Once I get that burst of anger out, it's pretty much smooth sailing from there. Yeah, I'll be agitated or whatever, the remnants of it. But anger is a very fast vibratory pattern in which it wants to go in and break something up. The adage or the story of when Jesus went into the temple and threw the money exchangers out of the temple comes to mind. He uses targeted anger to disrupt patterns and force them back into coherence or a state in which was harmonious. This is a great example of how you can use what we call negative emotions to restore order and maintain structure when something needs to, have a boundary put up, which is what anger really is for. But in the modern era, it gets twisted into being angry about not getting something you just kind of wanted or, something silly happens. Likewise, happiness is a much similar emotion, but it moves at a much more graceful pace. So happiness can be felt and be in tune with other beings that are more harmonious with their environment, like angels. And they will typically maintain that vibratory state as their base level because they are in connection with the universe. So when you look at emotions like happiness, it's a much slower pattern with not such high peaks as anger, but it creates like a platform for you to build upon. Dan Winter has done a lot of work with looking at the coherence of the heart. He actually has a website called heart-coherence.com, and that website and his websites just detail how when you look at the frequencies of these different emotions, they behave just like you would expect. Anger is that sharp spike. Happiness or joy is that slow platform you can build upon. And these signatures represent basically how you feel these emotions in the body. And what's interesting about emotions like joy or love is that they closely resemble the pattern of the phi ratio or the golden ratio. This ratio or pattern is a great way to cut through energetic signatures and maintain a sense of yin and yang, because when you have one frequency goes 0.618 this way, you have the other one go the opposite way, 0.618. You constantly drill down into lower and lower frequencies of reality. And that's why I think that people who are in states of bliss or in states of resonance with high spiritual loftiness or being in tune with the universe, they tend to contact these more angelic beings Because if you really think about it, the more negative or denser beings will be closer to physical matter. So if you look at, going back to the example of how when these compression waves slowly compress and create more and more compression, what's happening after a frequency hits that center point, it comes down and they dial up on each other, and they get smaller and smaller, and then become compression waves. They continuously stack more and more compression on top of each other. And you can think of these higher realms of reality, or heaven, or as it's commonly called in theosophy, devachan, as being within our reality, but at scales that we can't really touch physically. It makes sense that you would have positive beings who are more joyous in their natural expression at a smaller scale than the more dense beings who would sit closer to matter or physical expressions. And that's why when people are fearful or angry or in a state of being associated with the more dense aspects of reality, matter, you're hearing people who have these negative experiences where they communicate with demons, or they are dealing with Satan, or whatever they want to call it. But really, they're dealing with disincarnated entities who sit at a much lower frequency spectrum than these lofty angelic beings. And if you understand this and understand that there are different intelligences that sit at different scales of reality or different harmonic frequencies, it becomes pretty clear that what people have been talking about is by raising your vibration, you're getting yourself away from these more demonic or negative entities and moving towards a more harmonious angelic frequency or set of beings that encourage your growth, as opposed to trying to drag you back down so that they can resonate with your energy as you're putting out these different expressions or emotions. So it's not hard to imagine that when a being such as like a negative entity or negative being is picking up on a human being who's going through a rough time and is really associating with that sadness or that anger, it makes sense that they would come along and sort of poke at us to try to get more energy out of us, because misery likes company. And a lot of spiritual teachings talk about how there are beings that didn't really make it through the cut to the next stage of their evolution and kind of got stuck here on the earth plane with us. And they're not really alive, so to say, or dead, but they're just disincarnated, existing sort of in between our reality and the next harmonic frequency, or just whatever layer you want to call it, devachan, whatever. They're in this limbo, and the best way for them to get out of it is to either go within and raise their base frequency, or to continue to exist in that lower state of energy and continue to poke us and agitate us. This is actually the source of what people call satanic forces or demonic forces. There are these entities that are stuck, not wanting to evolve further, and are trying to set up a home base here within our reality where they use us as energy to feed upon, or to utilize as they can continue their negative expressions of maintaining in these low energetic states. And it makes sense that they would do things like influence our world leaders, or try to get us, when we're already in a negative headspace, into a more negative headspace so they can get more energy, and also get us to look at the world in a more material sense. Because if we en masse move on beyond these lower frequency states, they don't have anything else to feed on. They don't have anywhere else to go, and they become stuck by themselves and then have to do a lot of internal work to move on to that next level. So when you hear people talk about he's and say things like, he's possessed by Satan. What they're saying is that they are obsessed with working with these negative energies so they can better themselves, as opposed to, raising up the collective. And that when people make these blood sacrifices to these demonic entities, what they're doing is they're literally, as the word has been used, loosh. They're providing loosh to these beings so they think they're getting something in return, but really they're just dragging themselves further and further into negative expressions. So when you look at this in this way, it kind of blurs the line between what's positive and what's negative, what's really happening here. And it's moving towards an idea that everything is an individuated expression of the one universe, and that we're all trying to reach a point of stillness in which we can move back into unity with everything. And there's just different pockets or different layers of us, whether we're in a body or not, working towards that goal of unifying with the universe again and getting rid of that agitation or vibration and making it more harmonious, so that when we do operate again as physical or incarnated beings, we are working in a more harmonious fashion. So with that in mind, I think it's good to want to remain in these elevated states more often than not. And while when they say raise your vibration, it does sound like a lot of woo-woo a lot of the time, but the message is actually pretty good there. It's get yourself out of that negative headspace and remember that you can access joy just by remembering how it feels and bringing that vibratory pattern back to your core and allowing it to manifest. And yeah, with that, I think this also explains a lot of the different geometric patterns that have been floating around in different mystical teachings, like the Merkaba or the star tetrahedron or the flower of life. All of these are ways to show that energy can create a harmonious pattern at its center and then maintain it. Because if you look at something like the star tetrahedron, it's taking energy from the top and the bottom and then bringing it into the center, where it's creating a core and holding on to that energy. And when you look at the 3D version, which we call the Merkaba, it's the same thing. You're bringing energy from the crown chakra, the root chakra, and then trying to bring it into the heart so that you can maintain a harmonious connection to the universe by bringing the energy from the earth and the energy from the stars into coherence inside of ourselves.